Welcome to the video on corporate ESG considerations, a relatively brief one. ESG, of course, standing for environmental, social and governance factors. Well, the reason why it's going to be quite brief is that one of these, namely governance factors, are going to have their own section in the sort of follow-on batch of videos, and they also have their own section in the curriculum, so they will be discussed to a large extent. Environmental and social factors we discuss here. Now, there is, despite what we said in the previous video about there being, let's say, two opposing theories or conflicting theories of corporate governance, namely the shareholder theory, sort of the classic approach, and the more modern stakeholder theory, which has its own challenges, of course. The curriculum states that there is a shift among investors towards that stakeholder approach of corporate governance from a pure sort of shareholder perspective, and therefore, when making both operating decisions at the company level, investing decisions, financing decisions, ESG factors, environmental, social and governance factors, which do, embody a wider view of interest rather than just purely sort of financial interest of the shareholders, is becoming increasingly important. So in this video we will just provide some background knowledge or some basic information on ESG, reasons why it's important, for example, etc. Now, starting with environmental factors. These are factors associated with, speaking very generally, the conservation of the natural world. So here we will be, of course, concerned with issues like climate change, pollution, deforestation, biodiversity. Social factors are those which take into account or affect people and relationships between people. So this is all about consideration of people and relationships. So ideas or concepts like gender, equality, diversity among the workforce, but also relations with the community where a company is operating, human rights, labor standards, health and safety standards, governance factors, finally, are all those things that are to do with how the company is governed, how the company is run. So standards for running the business, especially how important strategic decisions are made. We said before that those decisions are the domain of the board of directors. So what is the board composition? What are the skills and experiences of the board members relative to the industry of the company? What are the policies on things like whistleblowing, so informing that something's wrong, lobbying, engaging in bribery, corruption, or with political donations, so political engagement, things like that. Now, while corporate governance have long been acknowledged and appreciated in the investment community as being quite important, because the effects of poor governance, poor decision making, for example, have an obvious sort of impact on company value. Whilst this has long been recognized as being important, the other two factors in this mix, so the environmental and social factors, those typically there is less clarity there, or less direct impact on company value. So the evolution with respect to the first two has been much slower than with respect to governance factors. Nevertheless, we are making progress indeed. Right. You have to be ready potentially to answer some form of theoretical question on or concerning reasons why the importance of ESG considerations has been on the rise. So reasons, let's say, for growing importance of ESG considerations, and obviously considerations. One is tempted to say, well, finally, people are thinking about the environment, social implications of a business's activity, and of course governance factors, which has been the case for a longer time. But that is not the finally it's natural to think about these things isn't the right answer. Your book gives the following explanation or the following rationale. First of all, there is growing, let's say, material, concrete, tangible, financial impact of ESG factors on issuers, in the sense that it is now actually hitting them and impacting them financially. So it's something they feel at their P&L level, income statement level. Think about losses that companies are suffering due to various environmental shocks, like extreme weather conditions, flooding, hurricanes, extreme droughts, combined with very heavy rain, for example, sometimes in a very short space of time. That is affecting the companies materially, causing them to lose assets, for example, and now they're feeling the effects. They're also taking note of these things. Social controversies, things like mistreatment or not ensuring the well-being and safety of employees, that is also coming to hit them financially, as employees are more vocal about their experiences and more ready to take such cases further. Governance deficiencies are also impacting and affecting companies and investors. So this is finally coming to light, and it's not just coming to light, it's hitting companies' bottom line, hitting companies' income statements. The next reason, let's say, is that there is just growing interest in the community at large, growing interest in these, let's say, factors or these concepts, these issues, especially among the younger segment of the population, especially among younger clients, and also younger investors who do want their money to be invested along with certain principles. For example, they want their amassed accumulated wealth to be managed with ESG in mind. So companies have to take note. And another factor comes from the fact that the governments are also bringing these ideas to the front, and governments are now, many governments at least, I'm not saying that all do, are now starting to prioritize, for example, climate change, but also social policies. So various measures are introduced at the government level and making their way into, new or amended tougher regulations, which aim to curb companies', let's say, thus far liberal approach to environmental issues or social issues. So new regulations force issuers, I guess, to change, to adapt and adopt ESG, sort of ESG mindful approaches. Now, there are a couple of, let's say, important terms that you need to know here. First of all, the idea of negative externalities, which is something you may know from economics. Historically, the approach has been that, the byproducts or the side effects, for example, of manufacturing. So the historic treatment of things like pollution, which is, definitely a byproduct of manufacturing activity, at least some manufacturing activities, or the negative social impact of things like, getting people to work in shifts so that production can go on around the clock. Well, shift work, the fact that some people work during the night time, others work during the day, isn't, let's say, completely neutral for the well-being of society, because it does lead to certain problems like, family problems, difficulties, especially when you've got children, that kind of thing. Well, these were historically treated as so-called negative externalities. It's also possible to have positive externalities in economics, but let's say negative ones. I just thought of another impact of shift work, health problems with the quality of sleep, which over the longer term can lead to series of chronic illnesses among those affected by that kind of work pattern. But with negative externalities, or this kind of approach, or this kind of treatment of these issues, the cost is borne by society, not by the company or the investors, the owners. The cost is borne by society, not the company and its investors. Well, from that kind of treatment, where it's that kind of approach where it's, well, that's not my issue, right? We are seeing a shift towards what is described as internalization of these costs. So towards internalizing these costs, so trying to make them bear and impact the company's P&L, the company's profitability. Because the effects that certain activities cause, like pollution or social impact, are becoming increasingly possible to quantify and measure, and therefore convert into dollars, euros, or whatever other currency, and make the company put these costs, well, first of all, charge the company for these costs via various, carbon, let's say, costs, and make the company reflect that effect in the income statement. Of course, these ideas are still in their sort of early stages, but we are definitely seeing that shift. Now, what your book proceeds with is a bit more of a discussion of the different factors, so environmental, social, not so much with governance, because, as I said, that has its own individual learning module. So for environmental factors, I guess these can be, for many of you, quite obvious, right? What those factors are. And we did mention a few, like pollution, deforestation, or, the loss of biodiversity. Well, first of all, your book states something quite obvious. The impact of these factors will vary across industries. If you're a company providing services, the impact may not be as big as for a big manufacturer who, uses raw materials, commodities, and so on. Now, More specifically, they talk about issues surrounding or concerning climate change and the type of risk climate change causes. And that is the authors of the curriculum, talk about two types of risks here, namely physical risk and transition risk. So physical risk is the sort of obvious one. As a result of climate change, there may be, damage to your infrastructure, damage to your assets, typically from or caused by extreme weather events like the previously mentioned floods, hurricanes, droughts, and so on. I mean, if you've got crops, they may be destroyed due to extreme weather. And of course, there is some possibility to insure against such events, although insurance is becoming increasingly difficult to find as these events become harder and harder to predict and actually quantify. And it's also possible to potentially diversify your operations across different geographical, locations so as to spread that risk. Now, the second type is the less easy one, I guess, to think about. That's transition risk, and this one is the effect of regulation or shifting consumer demand. And I guess, this second one, shifting consumer demand, basically means that consumers are increasingly turning to, let's say, greener options, and they may be less likely to go for certain things produced using older technologies which are more polluting. And anyway, governments, at least in some countries or some jurisdictions, via regulation, are forcing companies to shift or transition from, let's say, more carbon-intensive to less carbon-intensive ways of, for example, manufacturing. Now, this also is connected with the risk of then being left with so-called stranded assets. Stranded assets are, elements of infrastructure like an oil well from which you are extracting crude oil, or perhaps a mine that hasn't been even fully mined, or a coal-fired power plant which still could have been used, but it's become stranded because it's no longer viable to operate it, given either changing consumer demand or actually regulation that has made it either unprofitable or indeed completely impossible to do things in the old way. So stranded assets is a term you should definitely know. Now, I'm just looking at my notes whether there is really something genuinely new there about the other two factors. Your book obviously has a paragraph on social factors, but they kind of repeat what I already said. They talk about this relating to practices, corporate practices that impact on employees, on communities, potentially also on customers. So these are ideas or concepts associated with things like compensation, employee health and safety, employee morale, employee or workforce diversity. I believe I did mention these before. Now, as I said, we will be talking about governance factors separately in the next couple of videos, but think about issues like, company ownership and how that then translates into voting power, which is hugely influential or important for how decisions are made. The skills and expertise of board members, are they relevant to the industry in which the company operates, or do they come from completely different backgrounds and don't have much to add to the discussion? management compensation, how are managers compensated and how that compensation is aligned with company results. Those are very important topics or important ideas. And finally, I mean, in this section, your book contains some, or your curriculum contains some guidelines for evaluating these ESG-related risks and opportunities. So I'm going to jot this down, but it's really simple, and I don't believe you should ever have to learn this. I mean, it's so self-evident, or so easy. If you get a question on this, the correct answer will probably hit you immediately as being correct. So evaluating ESG related risks and opportunities. Although, despite saying an opportunities, I think the focus is more on the risk side. So, as always, when a risk or opportunity, emerges, makes itself apparent, the first step is to quantify the impact of that specific factor on future cash flows, and try to, of course, so if you can quantify the impact on future cash flows, why not also discount that impact to sort of present value? And then they say that probably if the impact is big, so if significant, that impact, then probably you will sooner see a pretty sort of quick, immediate effect on the share price, on the company's equity. After all, it's the holders of equity who have the residual claim on the company's assets. So if company value is suffering as a result of this quantified impact, or that's the expected effect, then it's going to be equity value that gets affected. Of course, it's possible to also feel an impact, or for the debt holders to be impacted. So possible impact or effect on debt instruments as well, but typically, less than what you feel on equity. After all, debt holders are protected and have a higher priority claim. So less than on equity, although what happens quite often, maybe not immediately, is that a company who is affected by ESG risks, for example, environmental ones or social ones or governance ones, may indeed see that over time their bonds get downgraded by rating agencies, and that will lead to a higher cost of obtaining debt financing. But the effect typically isn't as immediate as you would see on the share price affecting holders of equity.